Welcome, one and all, and welcome to those who have joined us on this medium this evening for a webinar on reparations and racial reconciliation. The goal here is to create a welcoming and safe space for us to look at how we can repair the long damage that has been done by racism in our nation and in our communities. And I'm so honored that we have James McKim among us, and he's going to be making a presentation. As some of you may have seen, James and I had a conversation earlier this summer about our different experiences of race, being both in the same class at the same undergraduate college at Dartmouth. James is also a longstanding member of St. Matthew's in Goffstown, where Nancy Vogel is the rector. He is a member of the choir there. And beyond that, he is also the current president of the Manchester chapter of the NAACP. And in even wider circles, he has a really significant leadership role in the Episcopal Church, the wider church beyond New Hampshire, is an active and leading voice in the Executive Council's Committee on Anti-Racism and Racial Reconciliation, which is a mouthful, and they reduce it to ECAR. Is that correct? I think I pronounced that right. So James, in addition to being a choir member with a wonderful voice, and I heard his voice even at Dartmouth, I hear it now in different layers, and it's a pleasure to get to hear him tonight. Today, as it so happens, September 14th, is a special day. It's one of those red letter days in the Episcopal Church calendar. It's Holy Cross Day. It's the day that we contemplate the meaning of the cross, our cross which adorns our rooms, our worship spaces, some of our homes, our chapels, our churches, both inside and out. Colin Chapman is our digital verger today, and I asked him to show a photograph of a cross that I walk by every day. It's a cross which is formed by some barbed wire and fencing, metal fencing, that a maple tree, over the course of many years, it was abrading against this tree, and the tree, in order to live, decided not to die somehow, but kind of embraced the cross, embraced this barbed wire. And I see this as part of how we pray that we will take up our cross when we talk about the damages in our relationships, damages that are across political spectrum, across race, across gender, across economic divisions, and in our personal histories. I know that there are crosses within me, just as though there's a cross inside this tree, that connects me, I believe, to my Creator, my Redeemer and Sanctifier. It connects me in these conversations. It's not always comfortable. And yet it is, I think, as the prayers for Holy Cross Day suggest, they are none other than the means of life and freedom, true freedom, not merely a panoply of choices, of personal choices, but true freedom that allows me to serve and love others without counting the cost to myself. So I lift that up as a way into these conversations, as a way of how we take up the cross as followers of Jesus, and how we bear each other's burdens. And let me just offer this prayer for Holy Cross Day. Almighty God, whose most dear Son went not up to joy, but first he suffered pain and entered not into glory before he was crucified, mercifully grant that we, walking in the way of the cross, even in these conversations sometimes, may find it none other than the way of life and peace and true community in God's sight. This I pray through Jesus Christ, your Son, our Lord. Amen. Thank you. Now I'm going to pass it over to James or Alana.
I would just like to say a word before we begin more fully our time together. As Bishop Rob has mentioned, tonight is the outgrowth of the continuing commitment of the Episcopal Church of New Hampshire to have conversations around racial reconciliation and repair of the world in its varied manifestations in our lives and our larger communities. So tonight's time together is not meant to be completely comprehensive, but another piece of our journey in this path of challenge and this path of unexpected gifts as well. One of the things that is really also important, looking at that sense of full relationship and repair, is that we are in the Episcopal Church of New Hampshire. I myself am in Nashua at this time. And as we begin, we also want to acknowledge that we are on the sacred ground of native land, that our discussion is being held on the traditional lands of the Cowassuck Band of the Pennacook Abenaki people. And we pay our respects to the elders of that community, the past elders who carried the wisdom for that community, and present as well as extended into the future, that we are also called to conversation and reconciliation with other Native people here today. And as followers of Jesus, in this sense of embodied relationship, we're compelled to have this conversation, affirming that each of us is made in the image of God, and that we bring those values of equity, inclusion, and diversity to our conversation. I'll just quickly introduce myself. My name's Alana Van Antwerpen. I serve as the missioner of the Digital Mission. And tonight we also have a few other panelists. So Gail, if you would like to introduce yourself, and then I know Bishop had mentioned Nancy as well, but if you could go ahead, Gail.
Right. Yeah. Good evening, everyone. I am the Reverend Gail Avery, and I am on Bishop's staff and canon for transition and community engagement. And I'm the staff liaison for the Reconciliation Commission.
Right. And Nancy, can you say a little more of a word about yourself and your ministry here in New Hampshire?
Sure. My name is Nancy Vogel. I'm the rector at St. Matthew's Episcopal Church, home to James McKim and many other wonderful people. And I am the chair of the Reconciliation Commission. And so I'm very happy to be here tonight. I've heard James speak on this topic, and I cannot get enough of his incredible explanation and just discussion around reparations. So thank you, James, for being here tonight. And it's an honor to be here as well.
All right. Thank you, Nancy. And without further ado, Mr. James McKim, I turn it over to you.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Bishop. Thank you, Gail. Thank you, Nancy. Thank you, Alana, for inviting me to speak and to share some thoughts around this topic that is near and dear to my heart and near and dear to many folks around reparations. And so I'm going to share my screen now. And I would imagine that this slide, this image on this slide may be somewhat familiar to some of you. Some of it may not. I would love to just have you all start by typing in the chat, from what town are you? Just type in the chat, what town are you from? And that way we get a sense of who's here and this little community that we have. Pennacook, Nashua, Hopkinton, Dover, Goffstown, Manchester for my rector, Stratham, Londonderry, Cincinnati, that's interesting, New London for Lucretia. Excellent. So thank you. It's always good to have a sense of who we are on the call. I want to also just say this is really an introduction to this topic of reparations. There's so much more that has been studied that could be said. I could speak on this for days, but I only have about 45 minutes, 43 or so now. So I'm going to try to target this a little bit as an introduction and to give you the breadth of what reparations is and can be about, and some motivations for engaging in this work. I start this off with a statistic. The Brookings Institute says that today, the average white family has roughly 10 times the amount of wealth of the average Black family. The Pew Research Center actually has a statistic that says that's 13 times. White families have 13 times the amount of wealth of the average Black family. So that's a startling statistic in and of itself, and is worthy of our attention. We, in talking about a topic like reparations, know that this topic is emotionally charged. And so when engaging in topics that are emotionally charged, there can be some conversational norms that you might look to agree to abide by that might help with the conversation. And we're going to have some interaction here, hopefully, in a few minutes. And we're going to ask that you perhaps adhere to some of these norms. And feel free to think about using these norms in conversations that you have. First of all, stay engaged. This is an emotional topic, and we've been taught to shy away from topics of race, gender, religion, politics, but we cannot solve problems in those areas unless we talk about them. So staying engaged is important. Sharing the airtime. We want to be inclusive. When you speak, let 2 or so other people speak before you speak again. Next, be patient with yourself and with others. We all have different experiences. We all have different ways of thinking. And we may get something, we may get a concept faster than someone else in the room with us gets a concept. And that's okay, because they have different experiences than we have. We may not get a concept as fast as someone else does. So we want to be patient with ourselves and with others. We're talking about a situation where there's experiences that not everyone has. Next, speak your truth as you're able. Speak your truth, not someone else's truth. Speak your truth as you are able. And the way we can do that is to use I statements. I think this, I feel this way. I'm impacted in this way when I hear that. Next, notice your judgments. We're not saying don't have judgments. We have to make judgments to live in this world with all of the information that comes in our senses. But notice your judgments. Notice when you're thinking that someone is bad in the world because of the way they look or the way they behave. Next, we're all teachers and we're all learners. We are all teachers and we're all learners. We all have something to teach because we have unique experiences. We all have something to learn because we have unique experiences, every one of us. Next, expect and accept non-closure. I'm going to talk in a minute or so about the history of discrimination in this country. It has happened over 400 years. Our culture has grown and developed over 400 years. That is not something we're going to change overnight, next week, next month, next year, and probably not in our lifetimes. So we need to expect non-closure and accept that non-closure. Now, that does not mean that we don't fight to make change. It just means we should not get too frustrated when next week racism isn't cured. And then oops and ouch. This is one of my favorites. If you're in a conversation and you say something, and as soon as the words leave your lips, you recognize that did not come out the way that I wanted it to come out. You can say, oops. And that lets everyone with an earshot know that what came out of your mouth was not your intent. And there's an opportunity to unpack that, to understand what may have come out that may be misinterpreted. Conversely, ouch is if you hear something, someone says something, it doesn't land on you right, you can say ouch. And that lets the speaker and everyone know that what was said struck you wrong. It's not placing a value judgment either way. It's just back to the I statement. It's letting others know what you think. So think about it, following these norms as you have these difficult conversations about these topics. So I want to, in this time we have together, give you a better understanding of the issues involved in reparations, to understand that the matter is complex and to begin to get a sense of what can be done in the context of being part of the Episcopal Church, in the context of the Becoming Beloved Community long-term commitment that has been announced and is being lived into throughout the church. The way that I hope to accomplish those objectives is by talking a bit about the history of this nation, which and some of the history that many of us have not learned in school. We're going to define reparations. We're going to talk about levels of discrimination where our society is broken, where our relationships are broken, and talk about what can be done, what is being done, and what can be done about that. So that's where I'm hoping to go. And so along with that, I want to start with just having you type in the chat, if you would, what questions you might want me to answer during this short time we have. And I'll see if I can work them into my presentation. And I see in the chat, it looks like Barb might have her hand up and has a question. So just feel free to type questions into the chat. And I guess we have a chat and a Q&A at the same time. But I'm looking more at the chat, so happy to look there. Otherwise, I have questions for you. Does anyone recognize the two gentlemen in these photos? Okay, so we do have one question. Why reparations is so hot? The topic. Such a hot topic. Okay, good, good. And we have a yes from Betty, so I'll look at that. So Bishop Rob answers, and Bishop Rob gets the bing, 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 bing. Sherman and Johnson. Yes. So General Sherman, General William T. Sherman, and President Andrew Johnson. And they have come to somewhat represent this notion of reparations, because after the Civil War ended, General Sherman issued his special field order, his special field order number 15. The order provided for the settlement of 40,000 freed slaves and Black refugees on land expropriated from white landowners in South Carolina, Georgia, and Florida. These orders became the basis of the claim that the Union government had promised freed slaves 40 acres and a mule. So that was General Sherman. Enter President Andrew Johnson. After the assassination of President Lincoln, President Johnson revoked General Sherman's field order number 50. So the 40 acres and a mule were never actually given to the slaves as a recompense for their slavery. So a little bit of history there. But moving on, a bit more history. This is a chart that appeared in the Washington Post a little over a year ago that tracks some of the history of Black oppression in this country. And it starts in a place where the first slaves were brought onto this continent, in Norfolk and Hampton, Virginia, which is actually where my father's family is from. This was a little over 400 years ago, before the Mayflower arrived at Plymouth Rock. So the presence of slaves from Africa was integrated into the earliest days of European colonization of what is now the United States. American colonies were slave states before they were states of the American Union. Slavery was part of the United States at its outset. In fact, it's referred to as the nation's original sin. How many of you heard of Crispus Attucks? Anyone heard of Crispus Attucks? He was the first person in America to die for American freedom during the Boston Massacre, is when he was shot. So even then, African Americans are playing a role in the forming of this nation. Slavery ended with the Civil War and the ratification of the 13th Amendment. Although there is debate about whether the ratification of the 13th Amendment truly eliminated or ended slavery. And if you watch documentaries and read the book, The New Jim Crow by Michelle Alexander, which was by Episcopal Church Resolution, a book that we should have all read. She talks about how slavery really is just morphed. And the 13th Amendment was the first morphing. So interesting to perhaps read that book. But within a decade or so of that ratification, a new institutionalized oppression emerged. Laws were created across the nation, barring Black Americans from voting or otherwise participating as equals in society. The intervening decade, the Reconstruction era is what it was called, was a period in which America tried to rectify the effects of slavery. That period ended in 1877 with a compromise over the previous year's presidential election, an informal agreement that allowed federal troops to pull out of the South as they were trying to keep the ending of slavery as a reality. Those laws were referred to as Jim Crow laws, and they segregated the South for decades after slavery was barred legally, establishing racist tiers to society that prevented Black Americans from matching whites in employment, income, political engagement, land ownership, and he was heard of redlining. That was actually law across the country, that Black Americans could not own property. They could not be rented property in certain places in certain parts of towns. Organized campaigns of physical assault and murder, lynchings, often with quiet approval from authorities, from police, from law enforcement, from the legal system, reinforced that segregation. When slavery ended in 1865, formal oppression of Blacks continued for the next century. It was only the passage of the Civil Rights Act in 1965 and the Fair Housing Act in 1968 that most of the formal legal policies of segregation that were state laws, as well as some federal, were eliminated. Of course, changing laws doesn't change culture. So we're still experiencing the notion of segregation that many people have across the South and across the United States today. An interesting statistic is that as of 2018, and we're about 2 years away from that, but in 2018, 1 out of every 10 Americans currently alive were adults at the same time that Jim Crow laws and the Jim Crow segregation existed in the South. 1 out of 10. Some 26 million people living in the Deep South last year were adults at the same time that the Voting Rights Act passed. The point to be made here is slavery, Reconstruction, and Jim Crow made up more than 3/4 of America's history. And there are many people alive today who were living during that time, in that era. In addition to the overt discrimination, more subtle discrimination occurred. In the wake of the Supreme Court's Brown versus Board of Education ruling, there was a surge in schools named after Confederate leaders. Some of that has died down, although we just had this week, last week, I guess it was, the removal of the Robert E. Lee statue in a major park in Richmond, Virginia. Just removed, and there was a huge discussion, I'll put it that way, about whether that should be removed. Symbols may be being changed, but oppression is not over. And new backlashes occur daily. We still have killings of Blacks by police officers. We have the Make America Great Again movement. So I think Betty asked, why is reparations such a hot topic? It's such a hot topic because of the killings of last summer, similar to the killings of 1968. What's different now, and people ask me what's different now than in 1968, the murder of George Floyd was captured on video, on a handheld phone, and played all over the world. That incensed people. It was the first time anyone's really seen in the same shot the face of a Black man who is being brutally murdered and the face of the person who's murdering him. In the single shot, you saw both faces simultaneously. That, I think, is what really has captivated the nation and the world And it's propelled people to really want to wake up and sit and recognize we need to make a change. So that history is so important for us to understand, and it's the motivation, it's the reason why people behave the way that they behave. It's the reason why there are many Black Americans who are angry, yet they still proceed with their daily lives anyway. So that's a bit of history. And there's much more I could tell, but this gives you a sense of an outline and a timeline for how we've gotten to where we are today. I have a little video that I want to show that talks about what are reparations.
Economist William Darity and his wife, folklorist Kirsten Mullen, have been studying national reparations for years.
There are some blacks who have been very resistant in our audiences.
This will make us victims.
Yeah.
White people will look down on us. They'll have more reasons to hate us, treat us, harshly, more so than they already do.
But their audiences are more receptive to a reparation bill these days.
Also, it could include the provision of a fund that could support educational opportunities or entrepreneurial activity or improvements in community-based conditions and amenities. But we think for both symbolic and substantive reasons, a part of this must be the payment of a check to those who are eligible recipients.
And how big a check?
We start with 40 acres and a mule.
That was the promise that was never fulfilled.
A promise by Union General William Tecumseh Sherman to confiscate a huge swath of the Confederate coast and redistribute it as 40-acre plots to the newly emancipated. Assuming an acre cost something like $10 in 1865, and allowing for inflation and compound interest, Darity and Mullen put the present-day value of Sherman's promise at something like $2.5 trillion, $74,000 for each of some 35 million descendants.
The premise is that there's been a grievous injustice that has carried over multiple centuries, really.
People will say, oh, that was back then, but the fact of the matter is tremendous amounts of wealth were amassed, and only because of us.
But is there no statute of limitations on historical injustice?
Well, there's no statute of limitations if those injustices are still wreaking havoc.
Right.
The fundamental problem is the inadequate set of resources that blacks can transfer from past generations that creates the racial wealth gap. And that dynastic effect is associated with our whole history of white supremacy and racism in the United States.
On those rare occasions when we did manage to buy land and to develop it, all too often something happened, something insidious. They were cheated, someone was lynched in the family, the timing of a fire.
But of course, not everyone agrees.
You've been teaching at Brown for years.
Economist Glenn Lowry.
And Brown, like Georgetown, like Harvard, like Yale, was built to some significant extent by slaves, no?
Yes, that's certainly true. The Brown family fortune did have a lot to do with the slave trade. And there's nothing wrong with honoring the uncompensated labor of people who were enslaved, who built institutions like this.
But a national law.
My problem with reparations, especially as it expresses itself in terms of financial compensation, is that it misunderstands the nature of the injury, seeing blackness and African descent as some kind of subhuman category that would legitimate in the land of the free and the home of the brave, carrying on a commerce in human chattel. That was a deep and profound injury. It can't be made into a piece of cash.
But you're an economist. The legacy of slavery passed down from generation to generation, hampering, handicapping the progeny of those who were enslaved. Why not compensate them for the losses they've actually suffered?
I don't want my country to take 35 million people and so see them as mainly the descendants of slaves. 150 years? It's a very, very long time to nurture that dimension of my identity at the expense of every other aspect of my identity. African Americans like myself, we're doing fine. This is a great and open society, and we have been finally, and in the fullness of time, allowed to prosper. Those who are poor are poor. Their poverty needs to be confronted. There's no justification for giving increased attention to their poverty at the expense of other Americans' poverty.
You mean there's no difference in the legacy of a poor African American and a poor white in this country?
No difference worthy of our political attention.
Lowry has no problem with the proposed fix at Georgetown. Students there have voted for an added fee, $27.20 per student per semester for the 272 people sold, to be paid to descendants. The university has yet to approve it.
And the idea here is reparations should be made to the descendants of the people who were sold to keep the institution going.
I have a little bit of a problem with the word reparation. Black people can't be repaired in the midst of a broken white society. We cannot be repaired from racism and disenfranchisement when white supremacy continues to be a growing disease in our society.
So what word would you use?
How about some respect, some responsibility?
Acknowledgement.
Right.
This is business and economics correspondent Paul Solman reporting from Washington, D.C.
Oops. So I hope you found that interesting as a kind of a tickler introduction to this notion, this concept of reparations. There we go. I want to give you a little bit more of a definition. Reparations is a process of repairing, healing, and restoring. And if you notice in that last interview, she didn't like the term reparations, right? And so this notion of repairing and healing and restoring a people injured because of the group identity and in violation of their fundamental human rights by governments, corporations, institutions, and families is a more broad definition than we normally think of. That is a definition that has been identified by a group called NCOBRA, which is the National Coalition Organization for Blacks for Reparation in America. It's at the forefront of the reparations movement. And we're actually going to be having some reparations discussions led by the male co-founder of NCOBRA and the secretary of NCOBRA, who are actually Manchester, New Hampshire residents, Brenda and Willard Lett. So stay tuned for that. So with that definition, I want to shift a bit now to talk about the Episcopal Church, because we have embarked under the leadership of our presiding bishop, Michael Curry, on the Becoming Beloved Community long-term commitment. And as many of you are aware, he has made reparations, racial reconciliation, really one of his three main tenets of his episcopate, with creation care and evangelism being the other two. So Becoming Beloved Community is represented by this labyrinth that you see here. And the four areas of the Becoming Beloved Community long-term plan are, as you see here. And actually, I'd like to see how many people here have heard of Becoming Beloved Community. So do we have a raising of hands? Do we have that capability? Yeah, we've got 7, 8, 9, 10. So this is good. We have a good number of folks who at least have heard of Becoming Beloved Community, and up to 13, 14, I think I saw at one point. So that's good. So this notion of healing, truth, and justice is wrapped around, and we've had actually a number of virtual discussions that have been led by the presiding bishop, by President Gay Jennings, by Reverend Isaiah Brokenleg, who is the staff missioner for racial reconciliation for the church, because we're trying to achieve healing, truth, and justice through telling the truth about our history, through proclaiming the dream of who we could be, through practicing the way of love as we repair the breach, repair the brokenness. And we've actually, my committee, ECAR, as Bishop Rob mentioned, created a document, a framework for training around racial reconciliation and reparations. It's the guide for reconciliation and reparations training that's available on the Episcopal Church website. And the training that we try to make available around reparations and around racial reconciliation is based on that guide and that work that defines what are the terms we need to understand. What are the concepts we need to understand as we live into becoming beloved community? So I want to talk about each of these and also talk about each of these 4 areas: telling the truth, proclaiming the dream, practicing the way of love, and repairing the breach. I want to talk about them in a little more detail, but in the context of understanding discrimination. Understanding that discrimination happens at the individual level, around beliefs, feelings, values, attitudes, and behaviors. It happens at the group level, in terms of societal identities and positions of groups and subgroups of people, positions in a social hierarchy. And it happens at an institutional level. There's institutionalized bias and oppression that discriminates. Another way to look at that is that we talk about structural or systemic discrimination and how that is manifest. It's manifest through our culture, and as Resmaa Menakem describes culture as how our bodies reenact and retain history. Remember, we talked about the history, our true history, and history of slavery and how it's morphed over time. So our culture is how our bodies retain and reenact history through the foods we eat, the stories we tell, the images that hold meaning for us, the symbols that hold meaning for us. So as at the individual interpersonal level, our culture is discriminatory. At the institutional level, the group level, there are best practices, there are policies and procedures that are followed in institutions that may not be law, but they're the way that institutions operate. They're codifying behavior. And some of those, many of those are discriminatory. And that brings us into the systemic manifestations of discrimination, systemic discrimination, because institutions are systems, as are governments, local, state, and federal. There are laws. We talked before about Jim Crow laws that were discriminatory. There are still laws on the books today that are discriminatory. And we just had the New Hampshire legislature pass an HB 2, what is referred to as divisive concepts language, that is trying to prevent us from talking about these subjects. So we have to be aware that this discrimination is happening, the breach is happening at multiple levels. Dr. Tricia Rose of Brown University speaks of the systems as being, you see them around the blue image here, there's systems of wealth, systems of media, systems of housing, systems of criminal justice, systems of education. So when we think about reparations, we need to think about how do we repair the breach in these areas? The bigger picture context. I want to talk next about proclaiming the dream, because we're going to talk about, we talked a little bit about telling the truth, and I'll talk a bit more about telling the truth in a minute. But I want to talk a bit about proclaiming the dream, because it's always good to have a vision of where we want to go. And we have this notion of becoming beloved community, right? So the UN has developed the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which has been accepted all over the world. There are 30 human rights articulated in this declaration. And I'm just going to give you some of the 30. And I think you'll see by seeing them how they relate to this notion of proclaiming the dream of where we could be and recognize that we're not where we'd like to be, telling the truth about where we're not. All human beings are born free and equal of dignity and rights. Everyone has the right to life, liberty, and the security of a person. We don't have that today. No one shall be subjected to torture or to cruel, inhuman, or degrading treatment or punishment. The murders of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, Ahmaud Arbery, and others prove that we don't have that today. And I think I saw Betsy, someone raise their hand. Did I see? Oh, can I turn my video back on? I'm sorry. All right, so that's Zoom not working because it said I was sharing.
Sorry, James, you are sharing, but your webcam is off. We can't see your face.
Oh, you want to see me?
It would be nice. There we go. Thank you.
All right, thank you. Thank you, Colin, for clarifying that. So that was number 5 of the human rights in the Declaration. Number 7, all are equal before the law and are entitled without any discrimination to equal protection of the law. We just talked about the 13th Amendment to the Constitution that supposedly eliminated legal slavery, but really the way it's been enacted is such that people of color are not equal before the law. We just had a case, the Anton Stroud case here in Manchester, where justice actually was served, where 2 youths who were charged with the same crime were given different sentences. Number 10, no one shall be subjected to arbitrary arrest, detention, or exile. That is happening today here in the United States. So what's the dream? The dream is that we live into and achieve the rights described by this Declaration of Human Rights, by the UN. This is not just the United States, this is the UN. So what is this brokenness that we talk about? And this is a combination of telling the truth and understanding where the brokenness is. This is the chart I created, probably about I've been using this for probably 6 months, and the census results just came out. So before the census came out, the statistics, the numbers were that we were a 91.2% white state. We're now down to 86% white. And you can see the percentages of people of different races here. Hispanics, 3.1, Blacks, 1.3, Asians, 2.4, mixed, 1.6. And mixed, by the way, is the fastest growing race or ethnicity chosen. We continually hear that New Hampshire has no diversity. Well, if you're thinking racially, that's somewhat true, but these numbers show that there is diversity here. It happens to be concentrated in the larger cities of Manchester, Nashua, Portsmouth, Keene, Concord, but it's here. There are people of color in other places around the state. So let's talk about what's broken. What's broken for Blacks, African Americans. We're in a state that, as we said, is now 86% white, was 92%. Instances of COVID are a proof that there is disparate impact in healthcare, discrimination in healthcare. Even though the population, and these were statistics from April, even though the state was 92.8%, 92% white, whites only made up 73% of the cases of COVID. Even though Blacks were 1.4% of the population, they made up 5.6% of the cases. Even though Latinx population was only 2.3% of the population, they made up 8.5% of the cases. So in healthcare, the healthcare system is broken. I'm curious, does anyone recognize this flag that's on the picture? No, I know some people are, because some people have been in my sessions before, and so they'll recognize the picture. And I should say recognize the significance of the picture, because I think most people would recognize this as the Confederate flag, the flag of the Confederacy of the United States. This flag has holes in it, and the holes are from burning. This flag was found in the mailbox of an African-American family in Goffstown, where I live. It wasn't my family, but a family here in Goffstown. So culturally, discrimination is here today. From a law enforcement perspective, anyone learn to drive with your hands at a 10 and 2 position on the steering wheel? I know I did. I was taught to drive that way. In March of 2018, Brian Perez, an African-American, was stopped by the New Hampshire State Police, get this, for having his hands on the 10 and 2 position on the steering wheel. The arresting officer claimed that the driver was suspicious because his hands were at the 10 and 2 position. The court later found that that was difficult to credit and threw out the case. You would hope that the criminal justice system had policies and procedures that would have prevented that from happening, but it did not. So consequently, African Americans are living in fear of being pulled over. And when we see the likes of what happened to George Floyd and Breonna Taylor and Ahmaud Arbery, we don't know when death is going to come. So we're in a broken society when we have to live in fear. When anyone has to live in fear, we're in a broken society. But and this is the map of redlining for Manchester, and I talked about what redlining was a bit ago. But it's not just what's broken for Blacks, for Black bodies. There's also a brokenness for white bodies. And this brokenness is referred to by Tandika, who wrote the book, Learning to be White. She calls this wages for whiteness, which is a takeoff on W.E.B. Du Bois's Wages of Whiteness, if anyone's read his books. And what she says is the wages for whiteness, the brokenness for whiteness, is that many live in shame, shame with the knowledge, sometimes unconscious, that people of color are not being treated with dignity and respect. Dignity and respect. Those words should mean something for us as Episcopalians. It comes from our baptismal covenant. We seek to uphold the dignity and respect of every human being. People socialized as white, and I use that term because being white is socialized. We're not born being white or Black or recognizing that. People socialized as white live in fear. Fear that a person of color will harm them. There's a great video put out by the New York Times called the Peanut Butter and Jelly Racism video. It talks about how what's been ingrained in us through media, through what we've been taught, that a black male is dangerous. So we live in fear that a black male, when we see them, will harm us. There's uncertainty. Uncertainty as to a place in society or the ability to be successful if people of color are given an equal chance and equal treatment. W.E.B. Du Bois called this the zero-sum conceptualization, where the thinking is a victory by one race means a loss for the other. If black workers, for example, what he was describing, are able to enter a previously all-white industry or occupational group or society, white workers then are faced with increased competition, with potential job loss, with potential wage reduction. He called this the modern economic paradox. If you want more examples of wages for whiteness, I suggest you read Heather McGee's book, The Sum of Us. So what is reparations when we get to implement it? What does that look like? Here's a way to think about it. The restorative justice approach defined as 5 core elements of reparations by the Public International Law and Policy Group talk about, first of all, restitution or return of what was stolen. And what was stolen was dignity. What was stolen is opportunity. So understanding what that restitution is and doing that restitution is part of the puzzle. It's only part of the pie. There also has to be rehabilitation. The woman at the end of the video clip I showed talked about the fact that society is still broken. We need to repair our culture. We need to repair our institutions. We have to rehabilitate our society. Then there's compensation. And this is what most people think of when they hear reparations. Compensation, and people think of monetary compensation, right? That's part of it because economic opportunity has been lost. Then there's satisfaction. Just because you pay someone something doesn't mean that they feel they've been justly compensated. So when the compensation happens, when the restitution happens, the people who've been aggrieved and injured have to say, yes, I agree that you have repaired my dignity, you've repaired the relationship. And even after satisfaction, there needs to be this guarantee of non-repeat. You fix it once, you fix one situation, but if society is still broken, the injury is going to continue to happen. So we have to have some guarantee in society that we're not going to just break our relationships again. So with that as the aspects of reparations, we have to ask ourselves some difficult questions. We talk about equality, right? We talk about treating everyone equally, and we think we should treat everyone equally, and that's a great goal to have. The challenge is we're not equal now. So to treat everyone equally does not necessarily make sense. So the question is, are we willing to accept inequality to achieve equality? Are we willing to accept equitable treatment of people so that we can eliminate the disparities we just talked about, so that we can have equality? Who receives the justice? Is it just those people who are descendants of slaves? Or does that include people from who are recent immigrants from African countries who are Black, but don't have family who've been here, but yet are treated in the same way that Blacks who have been here are treated, discriminated against in the same way. So should they receive the compensation? Who dispenses this justice? Is it just government? Is it all corporate institutions? Is it nonprofit institutions? Who's going to dispense this justice? And in New Hampshire, who's going to do this? There is a national impact, there's a state impact, there's a local impact. We've talked about some example implementations. We've heard about the South Africa Truth and Reconciliation Commission. The state of Vermont has just passed a bill to form a statewide Truth and Justice, a Truth and Reconciliation Commission. This is one of the things I'm working on for the state of New Hampshire, to put forth legislations for us to form a Truth and Reconciliation Commission, because that's part of telling the truth about who we are, so we can expose the disparities and start the healing. Telling the truth, we know telling stories heals. Just telling stories heals. Georgetown University, we saw a little bit about Asheville, North Carolina. The city government, the mayor apologized and is providing funding to promote ownership, home ownership and business ownership among Blacks in the Asheville, North Carolina community. In Maryland, the Episcopal Diocese has earmarked $1 million for reparations efforts. Not sure we're going to be able to do that in New Hampshire. We don't have as much of a population, but think about that. If we were to set aside money, and we have money actually set aside to do some of this work. We have a Reparations Commission, and Reverend Vogel is our chair, and I'm a member. The bishop and Canon Avery are involved in that. And we have money to help efforts that are doing this work around reparations, around reconciliation. Virginia Theological Seminary is spending quite a bit of money on this as well. So we have a number of examples of how to make this happen. I want to just quickly touch on, and I'm wrapping up here, how do we know when we've succeeded? How do we know when we have the guarantee, not just the satisfaction, but the guarantee that we've repaired that breach? And I will just point to a great work by Peggy McIntosh called The Invisible Knapsack, unpacking the invisible knapsack of white privilege. And she lists, there are about 50 scenarios that explain what privilege people socialized as white have. One great example is you can walk into a hotel room. Hotel rooms usually have in the bathroom complimentary shampoo, body lotion, soap. So whose hair does that shampoo work for? Probably not hair of people with kinky hair like mine, right? It's designed for white people's hair. Now, I really call that white normative. Our society is built on the norm being white. And it's that normativeness, I think, that allows the privilege to happen, that allows you to go into a hotel room and expect that the shampoo is going to work for you. There are many other examples, and the unpacking the invisible knapsack gives you a number of them. So that will give you, I think, some sense of how we can measure if we've really succeeded in this, or what progress we're making. Practicing the way of love. How do we do that? There have been a number of podcasts by the presiding bishop. There are a number of articles that have been written. Bishop Rob has written about this. I just want to highlight a few things. Learning the truth about where we are. That's a way of practicing. Practicing love in terms of understanding our environment, understanding people. Commit to take action to bring about racial reconciliation. Don't just think about it. Don't just say, yeah, I'll do it. Commit to it. Join a group. I'm president of the Manchester branch of the NAACP, so I'll invite you all to join that group, or the Seacoast NAACP, or the Nashua NAACP, or join your church's social justice committee. Join a group. You can't do it on your own. None of us can. Look at how you can de-bias yourself. We are all biased. I do a workshop on bias, implicit bias, why we have it and how we can eliminate it. Take an active bystander training. People sometimes don't know how to react in a situation where they see discrimination. There's training that we give on how to act. Look at the policies and procedures and laws in your state and your local government, in your institutions in which you operate. Contact your representatives about the discriminations you see and call out or call in discrimination when you see it. Don't just let somebody make a remark that's discriminatory and not highlight it. Don't necessarily berate them, just identify it, because they may not know that they're being discriminatory. And last, I invite you to think about where in your sphere of influence, we all have spheres of influence, ourselves, our partners, our children, our extended family, our friends and neighbors. We have spheres of control and spheres of influence. So where can you, in your sphere of influence or sphere of control, take action? Where you're employed, in your government, your social networks, in the people you get services from. Where can you take action? So I'm going to stop there and just ask you to think about where can you take action? Where are you drawn to learn, act, do, or join? Thank you. And I think we're going now to, who's doing the questions? I've forgotten. Oh, it's me still. So we were going to try to break out into small groups, and I don't think we can, right? We discovered we cannot break out into small groups to have some discussion.
If our other panelists can turn their video back on, I can put them back up on the screen. And also, James, if you could turn off your screen share. There we go.
There we go.
Fantastic.
So do we want to just proceed with the panelists and talk about the questions? And maybe get some chat going in the chat screens as well to have people just share their thoughts on the questions? Would that work?
I think that sounds great, James. I know, as we kind of thought about our time together tonight, we wanted to ask people what was familiar to them in the presentation, and maybe what was new that you heard tonight as kind of a jumping off point. So as a participant, you're welcome to post in the chat responses to those questions.
And maybe we have the panelists to share their thoughts too, to get some juices flowing for folks in the audience. And Barkar raised their hand. So Kathy appreciates the different views on reparations. Great. So go ahead, Gail.
Well, I was just really thankful that you reminded me that, that we are socialized as white. And how, there's a white normativeness and that just really permeates our culture.
The famous study that was done shows that the socialization about race begins at 3 years old. 3 years old.
Yeah.
Alan said that he really loved the definition of reparations, always thought of it only in the context of, I believe, monetary compensation.
Yeah.
Betty says she's happy to have some specific things that we can do to take action. That I find so many people want to take action, but don't know how, don't know what the first step might be. And so I really wanted to share that, and also recommend Becoming Beloved Community Where You Are is a guide that Stephanie Spellers developed, and it's published on the Episcopal Church website. And we have a resolution, as many of you know, a diocesan resolution to live into racial reconciliation. And we've had a number of groups led by Betty and others around sacred ground. And Lucretia is just talking about sacred ground in the chat, an eye-opener for many. So many opportunities. We'll try to keep sharing in the newsletter and in other mechanisms, ways that you can take action, get involved, learn more, repair the breach.
I think for me, listening to your presentation tonight, James, just made me really step back and think about that historical timeline of 3/4 of our nation's history being steeped in the stringentness of having enslaved people, and then also the active laws that were meant to divide and suppress. And so really it's only been since the 1960s that there's this space of time, and during that space of time, the progress culturally. The other thing you reminded us of tonight was that sense of laws can be changed, but culture doesn't change overnight. And that is a long journey for all of us.
And not only the culture, best practices. It takes a while for best practices to be ruled as not really being best practices. Even into the 1980s, real estate agents had unwritten policies about who should be sold what property where. We had someone in the chat, I think I saw, asking saying more about the newsletter. So I'm referring to the diocesan newsletter that comes out every couple of weeks or so, right?
Oh, a couple of months.
Couple of months, sorry, couple of months. So going to I should probably let Gail answer this, but going to the Episcopal Church website, you can sign up for that newsletter on the website, nhepiscopal.org.
Yeah.
We have Alan is indicating, as a member of our Becoming Beloved community in Fayetteville, Arkansas. I so appreciate the education and I've received from the church and from other members, discussions, reading various books, and pilgrimage has been very enlightening. This is where I think the church has a very good opportunity to bring people together, to have these discussions, to have book reads, as many parishes have done, to go on pilgrimages. We in the Reconciliation Commission are working with the New Hampshire Black Heritage Trail. Some of you will recall that last year and this year, during Lent, we had stories of Blacks throughout New Hampshire highlighted every day of Lent. We're working in conjunction for Milford, and Reverend Hayes Junkin is working with the Black Heritage Trail to lift up the presence of Black Americans in Milford. And we're working on other locations as well. So that this is something that's powerful that the church can do. The church can lift up these memories and call in discrimination and lift up the places where people of color have contributed very positively to our society, to counteract the notion that Blacks don't exist here, first of all, and that they can't contribute to society, even if they do exist here.
At the beginning of your presentation, James, you asked kind of each of us one question that we have about racial reconciliation and reparations. And my question was communicating the importance of this topic to people who see themselves as first or second or third generation in the United States. Maybe, their groups have assimilated because they were afforded the privilege of lighter skin or particular education or, cultural group status. But how can we, when we're talking to people, really communicate the importance of this conversation for people who might say, my ancestors weren't even living here when people were enslaved?
So one response I would give to that is that there's a quote, and I believe it was Martin Luther King who said, and I'm going to paraphrase because I don't remember the quote exactly, but when one of us is injured, we are all injured. Might have been Thomas Dunn. I'll call on my classmate English major, Bishop Rob, because he probably remembers who it was.
Well, I think you were just referring to John Donne, and because I'm involved with mankind, one man's death.
That's it. 17 was it the number? So that's one reason I would give, that when one is injured, we're all involved there. The other is that, and I think I've talked about this before, the root cause of all the isms in this world, sexism, ageism, you name it, is that we don't treat individuals with respect. We don't treat individuals with dignity. We don't value individuals. We value characteristics of the dominant group. So if you're coming to this country and have not experienced the discrimination before, but you're part of one of those groups who is not the dominant group, you're going to experience discrimination. And therefore, this is your fight too.
One of the things that Alan wrote in the chat is the phrase that he likes, it's not my fault, but it is my responsibility.
Yes, yes.
And especially as people of faith, I really feel like that is a clarion call to that sense of relationship and wholeness. If Jesus in the gospel had stayed with those who, identified with the dominant culture, his ministry may not have even happened.
And wasn't it last week we heard in the gospel where Jesus's ministry opened up, because before this time he was focused on just the Jewish people. And this woman came to him who was not a Jew and asked him for assistance, and he realized that his ministry was broader than just to the Jews. I'd also say about that sense of it's not my fault, but it's my responsibility. The past may not have been your fault, but discrimination happens today, every day, every minute of every day, because the systems that are now in place are discriminatory. And if you are not actively changing those systems today, you are at fault, because you're letting it happen. looking at the chat, what do you think is the responsibility? The responsibility is for the one or one of a few POC in the Episcopal congregation.
That's right. That's
Right up my alley, I guess. You asking me? As an Episcopal, as a person of color in an Episcopal congregation? So I'll answer that by taking it even in the broader context. What's the responsibility of any person of color in the society? And the way that I approach this is society was built, I just talked about, and Gail mentioned, I talked about white normativeness. The society is built around people being white. The dominant culture controls how things work and power. So it is only the dominant culture who can make the change. What people of color can do is raise their hand and say, this is hurting, ouch. Please don't hurt me. And here's some ways that you might think about to not hurt us anymore. That's, I think, our responsibility to say, this is not right, to speak up and call in the system, to call in people when they're discriminated. That's about as far as we can go, though, because we don't hold the reins of power. Although in the Episcopal Church, you can say that's a little different because we have an African American who's our presiding bishop. We have a canon to the ordinary, a canon for a whole full third, almost 2/3 of his episcopate's major priorities, who's an African American. So in the Episcopal Church, we do actually hold some seats of power. However, we are a democratic institution. The presiding bishop is not a dictator, is not an autocrat, does not have the power to just say, this is the way it is, like the Pope does, and it's done. So the power structure within the ecclesiastics of the church is still predominantly white. Another question, is there a cognitive time to, I guess we're okay on time. Is there any federal level movement for making financially whole those who should have been able to make use of the GI Bill and get home loans as veterans? Wow, what a question.
Yeah, that's a good question.
So first of all, some people may not be aware of the fact that African Americans who should have been able to take advantage of the GI Bill to get home loans and to get into school, were actually not able to do so because of redlining, because of Jim Crow practices. There's a great book if you really want to learn about that, called The Color of Law.
Oh yeah.
By Richard Rothstein, and it talks all about the Jim Crow time, the laws and best practices that prevented even the GI Bill from people being taking advantage of that. There is not to at least my knowledge, a federal movement directly for that, but HB 41, the reparations bill that's come up a number of times in Congress, is an attempt at least to begin the discussion about what reparations should be. And remember, I had on one of my slides some questions we have to ask. We understand what the 5 components are, but there's some difficult questions we have to address. So I think this question about the GI Bill and home loans and whatnot is one of those questions we have to address. What is the reparation to be? What is the compensation to be? What is the repair that needs to happen?
So James, I just want to lift up one thing that you mentioned, and it's Heather McGee's book, The Sum of Us. And
Got that one some here too.
yeah, I have it upstairs. It is such a clear and fascinating read. I've really begun to see that so much of the divisions and the stark, just the hostility in our nation right now. We experienced some of it in Concord today in a demonstration. And you can't help but notice or think or be aware that the questions about the anti-mandate movement,
The mask, yeah.
masking, etc. It's all about don't tread on me. That language comes up, which is, the appropriation of a sign that was trying to get the British the British crown off our necks. But it's been appropriated for another reason. But you can't help looking at this through the lens of race now, I think. And part of what that is, and this is the reason why I mentioned the some of us, is this is really as much a racial, economic, political, cultural, it's that, but it's also a theological problem. It's asking us to imagine what is our relationship to God and what is God like and what does God want? And by listening to Jesus, and this is one of the power of Michael Curry's episcopate, I think, is he's asking us to look at how does Jesus behave in a zero-sum way? The example you have of the Syrophoenician woman that you just noted, even Jesus says, maybe God's grace isn't, if I give healing to the Syrophoenician woman's daughter, it's at the expense of the Jews, the people for whom I'm called. And he's actually said, no, he actually comes to turn and say, no, there's enough, grace is abundant enough to go around. And what I hear so much among those who are resistant to even broaching the topic of reparations is there's just not enough. And if we lift up those who have been oppressed, it's going to come at our expense, or we're going to become the oppressed ones. And that's the fallacy of the zero-sum game. And you start to, even when you start reading scripture and hearing stories like the one you just mentioned, you begin to see how that infects so much of how we think and how we sort of dole out our affection or attention to one another. If I give attention to somebody who looks and talks and has a different complexion than I do, or a different nationality than I do, then is it going to be at the expense of my own family? And Jesus is constantly saying, there's plenty. And the more you hoard, the less there is. So I'm just think that that is to be confronted.
I would even build on that and say that there's a richness in life,
yeah,
that we gain from truly engaging with people who are different from us.
Right.
Then we would not gauge. Doing one of my workshops, I even bring in Maslow's hierarchy of needs.
Yeah.
If you think about it, all the levels of actualization above the air we breathe,
right,
the water we drink, come from others, other people.
Right.
Love, security.
Yeah.
Up through self-actualization. We're only able to be ourselves and self-actualize if others around us help us to do so.
Right.
And that I think is what Jesus was trying to say.
I agree. Yeah.
Well, we are at 8:30, and I just want to honor each of you who have agreed to be with us this evening, and say thank you to James McKim for your presentation, for your time, and also for really expanding and deepening this conversation here in the Episcopal Church of New Hampshire. On behalf of the Digital Mission, I would like to invite you all to our digital conversation celebrating Indigenous Peoples Day on Sunday, October 10th at 4 p.m. That registration link will be available on our Facebook page, also on the Diocesan website and Facebook page as well. Bishop Rob, will you pray us out this evening?
I will. Thank you. And just thank you for everyone for joining us. And thanks for our panelists. And it's good to see everyone as always. And I look forward to the day when we can all be in person soon. This is a prayer that I'm borrowing, or I'm enlisting from the Archbishop of Canterbury, Justin Welby. Sovereign Lord Jesus Christ, who took human form and broke down the walls that divide, we seek your forgiveness for not living out the truth that all are one in Christ. We seek your forgiveness for the sin of racism. We pray for all those affected by the marginalization of prejudice and the violence of racist words and actions. We pray that we might uproot its cancerous and systemic hold on our own institutions, including the church. We pray that we might recognize and reverence your divine image and likeness in our neighbor and find joy in the resemblance. And we pray in your name, seeking your glory and your freedom. Amen.